Good afternoon. Yesterday I was here, I spoke at the farewell, party of Remy Aerts. Today we have another event. My name is Hanko Jurgens of the Duitsland Institute, and we are hosting a very special afternoon on the Historikerstreit 2.0 and all the debates which evolved during COVID, one have to say, since 2021. One often hears that Germany is a country which acknowledges its atrocities very well, with a vivid memory culture of which one could learn of. In 2019, Susan Neiman wrote a book called Learning from the Germans, in which she set the German memory culture as an example to the US. In most countries, she said, people tend to think evil is what others do. Not in Germany. How would it be if on an apartment door in Manhattan was written, "This house is built by slaves"? Or, in the past, Native Americans lived here, she asked herself rhetorically. And her book was a big success, also in Germany. Many people read it and indeed were convinced that one could learn from the Germans. But then suddenly in 2021, German historians were criticized. A heated debate ignited by what the Australian historian Dirk Moses called the German Catechism. Moses criticized the German consensus on the uniqueness of the Holocaust. While defending this uniqueness, comparisons with other genocides are, according to Moses, often not taken into account. Moses depicted German intellectuals as high priests, who by all means defend their ideas. Simultaneously, they tend to overlook the colonial context of German atrocities, both in the former colonies, German southeast and southwest Africa, as well as in Eastern Europe during the Second World War. Suddenly, many questions were asked about German memory culture, and many intellectuals participated in this debate. Michael Wildt is one of the leading German historians who took up the gauntlet in the edited volume Historikerstreiten, which I can really recommend to you all. Published together with, I already mentioned her, Susan Neiman, in which the different angles of the debate are discussed. Wildt pleads for a thorough re-evaluation of German colonial atrocities. And if we want to act in a future-oriented and sustainable way in a globalized world, the knowledge of colonial history should be aligned to the high level of Holocaust research. Michael Wildt was since 2009 professor of 20th century history at the Humboldt Universität Berlin, and in 2002 he held his farewell lecture on the singularity of the Holocaust, and this farewell lecture is published in 2022 in the Zeithistorische Forschungen, and I can recommend that to you as well, because there is a long discussion on the whole debate of the Historikerstreit 1.0, one could say, up until today. Also, he published a well-known book last year, Die zerborstene Zeit, Deutsche Geschichte 1918-1945, and he has such a long publication list that I can't mention all other books, but there are a lot. After Wildt's lecture, NIOD director Martijn Eickhoff provides a commentary, including the Dutch perspectives on the debate, and this is, I think, very exciting. We're very happy that you're there, because we had already a short meeting at the NIOD, and we think also as the Duitsland Institute, we think it's very important to communicate across the borders about these issues, because it's clear that also in the Netherlands a lot of debates about colonial violence have been held already in the last years, and particularly from the NIOD itself. So I'm firstly happy that you will have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much for your invitation. Thank you much for your kind invitation. And thank you for all you coming here to follow the debate and learn more about the German debate of the uniqueness of the Holocaust and what we called the Historikerstreit 2.0. The debate that was, of course, intensified by the historian Moses, who teaches in the United States, criticizing Germany's culture of remembrance with this mentioned essay in May 2021. This lecture cannot, of course, deal exhaustively with the extensive discussion, but must concentrate on a few aspects. So, for me, it's a central debate and central discussion about the uniqueness of the Holocaust and how is his relationship to other genocides and mass violence in the 20th century. And what I would like to argue is that even if you have a thorough look at the Holocaust, of these mass violence that we call the Holocaust, then inherent in the Holocaust, there is a lot of differences and developments that should encourage historians to have a broader view on this 20th century and 19th century and 18th century and mass violence. I will start with a short review at the Historikerstreit called 1.0 in the mid-80s, because this is essential for the German debate, because it ended with an interpretive consensus on memory policy and referred to a simultaneous nationalization of German memory policy in the course of the unification in 1989 and 19. It was the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas who introduced singularity or uniqueness in the public debate in July 1986 by criticizing Ernst Nolte's outlandish thesis of a causal nexus between Bolshevik and Nazi mass crimes. And I quote Habermas: "Nazi crimes lose their singularity by being made at least intelligibly as a response to today continuing Bolshevik threats of annihilation. Auschwitz shrinks to a format of a technical innovation and is explained in terms of an Asian threat from an enemy still at our gates." Quote end. The political background of Habermas' intervention has been evident when he insisted, and I quote him again, "the unreserved opening of the Federal Republic to the political culture of the West is the great intellectual achievement of our post-war period, of which my generation, the Habermas generation in particular, could be proud of." End of quote. This only patriotism that does not alienate democratic Germany from the West, Habermas argued, is the constitutional patriotism that could have formed the Federal Republic, and he once again, only after and through Auschwitz. It became evident how much the following controversy, which was more politically than scholarly, was shaped by thinking in terms of the Cold War that still prevailed at this time. The background to the public debate, however, was above all the fear that the political and cultural awakening that had emanated from the coming to power of the social liberal coalition under Willy Brandt in 1969 could be pushed back by a national conservative historical policy. Since taking office in 1982, Helmut Kohl's government has inscribed on its banners the demand for a geistige Wende, a moral turn, which meant the revitalization of conservative values and national self-assurance. So, for example, in May 1985, on the 14th anniversary of the end of war and the liberation from National Socialism, Helmut Kohl and Ronald Reagan laid wreath together at the military cemetery in Bitburg, even though members of the Waffen-SS were buried there as well as Wehrmacht soldiers. And Kohl declared on his visit in Israel in 1984 that his generation should no longer be reproached for guilt because we have the grace of the late birth. Reason enough, then, for the left liberal intellectual in Germany to fear that the geistige Wende was aimed at the renaissance of a nationalistic self-image of German society, with which the famous line was to be drawn under the Nazi past. As is well known, the Historikerstreit, which was in fact conducted almost exclusively by men, ended in a clear victory for the left-wing liberals. A comparison of the mass murder of European Jews with other genocides, in this case, above all, the mass crimes of Stalinism, was henceforth rejected because it was associated with the possible claim of an equation. The Holocaust became unique primarily for political reasons. This interpretive consensus of the singularity of the Holocaust at this time, which conservatives also subscribed in the context of German unity, was accompanied by a nationalization of remembrance memory policy. In the first decades after the war, mainly civil initiatives and survivors' associations in West Germany had commemorated the victims and the sites of the Nazis' regime mass crimes and called for public remembrance, often in the face of fierce resistance from local politicians with the unification. That is a decisive moment with the Unification Treaty of 1990. The new Federal Republic of Germany, not at least at the urging of the Soviet Union, assumed the obligation to care for the national memorials of the former GDR, which in a unified Germany now also entailed state funding for the Nazi memorials in the West. And the Nazi memorials in the West hasn't been funded until now by state fundings, but by regional or local fundings, but was initiatives of the civil society, often funded by associations from people around this in the local area. Now with this change in funding the Nazi memorials in the 1990s, public remembrance, public memory in Germany became a task of the state. For the memorial sites, this meant, of course, at an advantage, permanent funding, but at the same time, the state was now directing the politics of memory. So the memory of some kind of the Shoah was elevated as some kind of a Staatsräson, raison d'etat of the unified Germany. So, for example, the memorial for the murdered European Jews in Berlin, inaugurated with a state ceremony in May 2005, is a prominent example of how a civil initiatives was taken up by the government, not at least in the expectation that is important for the unified Germany, that this gesture of public representation of the mass crimes committed by Germans and in the Germans' names would promote the reputation of the newly unified nation in Europe and the world. With the, at this time, quite controversial decision to dedicate this memorial site solely to the Jewish victims, the normative, interpretive consensus of the Historikerstreit 1.0 about the uniqueness of the Holocaust, understood as the murder of the European Jews, so found its symbolic form at last cast in concrete. The positions of this former Historikerstreit, which was fought on a poor empirical basis, was quickly outdated. On the one hand, the mass murders in Rwanda, as well as the atrocities in the post-Yugoslavian civil war, led to an upswing in genocide research, for which comparison is an elementary component of analysis. In this context, the Holocaust provided the yardstick against which other genocides were compared, and differences and similarities were identified. However, political and social science approaches were dominant in the genocide research, and Holocaust research in Germany, which can only be seriously taken from the 1980s onward, was hardly involved in genocide research under the verdict of uniqueness. Both fields of work existed side by side for years without Holocaust research in Germany taking up impulses from genocide research, and conversely without genocide research taking note of the advantage in knowledge about the Holocaust research. The epochal break in 1989 and 19 widened the horizon of contemporary history research in several aspects. The fall of the Iron Curtain opened up the view of Eastern Europe, where the mass crimes of the Nazi regime had primarily taken place, and the democratization, democratization of the former socialist state made previously closed archives accessible for Western historians. And the next decades were marked by substantial empirical studies focusing on the occupation policy and mass crimes of the Nazi regime in East Central Europe and the Soviet Union. Instead of this long-stale dispute in Germany about Hitler's role in the process of the final solution, questions about the relationship between the center and the periphery, command from above, and initiatives from below, the relevance of regional institutions of occupations, administration, the intentions and interest of those involved, the actors on the ground, were now examined. As a result, the focus shifted increasingly from state to society. More than ever before, social actors became the focus of analysis, not only state actions of persecutions, but also everyday social exclusion, the participation of so many in the exclusion of all those who, according to the anti-Semitic and racist definitions, were not allowed to be part of the Nazi Volksgemeinschaft. In this research, the Holocaust proved to be a complex, violent event that encompassed different groups of perpetrators and different groups of victims. The Nazi policy of extermination was not only directed against Jewish victims, but also against Roma and Sinti, sick and disabled persons, or the populations in the occupied areas, especially in Poland and Eastern Europe. There are many historical reasons for this broader definition of Holocaust, and so I will present a few spotlights that will illuminate this argument. A few weeks after the anti-Semitic laws in April 1933, the Hitler government enacted the Law for Prevention of Hereditary Diseased Offspring, das Gesetz zur Verhütung erbkranken Nachwuchs, in July 1933, enabling forced sterilization of people defined as hereditary inferior. The measure was intended to systematically drive this group to extinction within one generation, which is why the 1948 United Nations Genocide Convention also refers to such steps to prevent the reproduction of a group of people as genocidal. In Germany, according even to the official Nazi figures, some 300,000 people were victims of forced sterilizations by the start of the war, indicating the extent of the policy understood as racial purification of the German national body. Although Jewish Germans were among these victims, of course, the forced sterilization, violent measures were generally directed against allegedly asocial, inferior people, including many Roma and Sinti. The Nuremberg laws of 1934, which forbade Jewish Germans to marry and have sexual relations with national of German or kindred blood, also covered members of alien races, which included Roma and Sinti, as well as black people. And at this point, it should be emphasized that these categories were anti-Semitic and racist definitions. The persecutors determined who was a Jew, a Gypsy, and who was black. It would be fatal to adopt this racist or anti-Semitic categorization of people in the analysis of persecution and argue, for example, that Roma and Sinti were not persecuted like Jews because Himmler had excluded purebred Gypsies. The war was undoubtedly a crucial condition for the murderous event known as the Holocaust. With Hitler's personal authorization, the murders of sick and disabled persons started the first systematic racist mass murder of the Nazi regime with use of gas chambers, which cost the lives of well over 100,000 people in Germany, Austria, and the occupied territories. An unrest grew among the German population as their family members were killed. The Nazi leadership, fearing an erosion of loyalty of the war, outwardly ended these killings in the summer of 1941, only to continue them covertly and in the occupied area territories anyway. But the technicians of the mass murder with gas were transferred to Poland in the end of 1941 to set up the extermination sites in Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. It was not the gas chamber of the Aktion Reinhardt that were unprecedented, but those at Grafeneck, Brandenburg, Hartheim, Sonnenstein, the killing site of the Euthanasia-Aktion. The war, intended and dubbed by the Nazi leadership as a conquest of Lebensraum, unleashed a genocidal violence of German settlement colonialism. The annexed Western Polish territories were to be Germanized. That means Poles and Jews, and Poles and Jewish Poles were to be expelled from there to that ethnic Germans from the Baltic and Sea and from the Baltic countries and other areas of the Soviet Union who were pushing home to the Reich could settle there. The war of extermination against the Soviet Union was directed with particular intent against the civilian population. German soldiers were to feed themselves out of the country, which meant, by a meeting of state secretaries in Berlin in May 1941, coldly stated that, quote, undoubtedly 10 million of people will starve if what is necessary for us taken out by the country by us. That was the horizon, the genocidal horizon of these bureaucrats in May 1941, that several tens of millions should starve and die for the purpose of the Wehrmacht. Major cities such as Leningrad were to be starved out. Soviet prisoners of war were confined in open fields to makeshift forced camps and left their fate without adequate supplies. More than 2 million Soviet prisoners of war died by the spring of 1942, a mass crime for which the Wehrmacht leadership was primarily responsible. Soviet Jews were considered in particular dangerous enemy in the eyes of the Nazis. Similar to Poland in 1939, the political and social support class of the Soviet Union was to be eliminated, whereby the German perpetrators were convinced in their anti-Semitic perspective that Judaism and Bolshevism were inseparably linked and that the murder of Jews would mean the liquidation of the Bolshevik leader class. In the Nazi view, Jews were the enemies per se who threatened security and endangered the pacification of the conquered territories and the Lebensraum that formed the later colonial Nazi Reich in the East. So, but this racist extermination also affected Roma and Sinti. More than 5,000 Roma deported from Burgenland, Austria, to the Litzmannstadt ghetto, including more than 2,000 children, were among the first victims to be taken to the Kulmhof extermination camp, where they were murdered by gas vents. Like the Jewish victims, Roma and Sinti were persecuted and killed down to the last link. If one sums up the research of the past decades, then the concept of uniqueness of the Holocaust, referring solely to the mass murder of the European Jews, recognizedly no longer depict this complex, intertwined, mutually radicalizing violent acts. The genocidal settlement policy radicalized the anti-Semitic policy in the occupied Poland. The murders of sick and disabled people built the murderers of the sick and disabled people built the extermination site in Poland. The mass murderous occupation policy against the civilian population, especially in the occupied Eastern territories, was directed against the Jews as well as against the non-Jewish population. At the center of the National Socialist policy of the racist reorganization of Europe was undoubtedly the extermination of the most dangerous enemy from their anti-Semitic perspective, the Jews. But this also included the complete annihilation of other groups defined in the racist sense as dangerous, inferior, including the idea of a racially poor German people's body that had to get rid of the so-called Ballastexistenzen. In scientific terms, talk of uniqueness is indeed meaningless, for every historical event is unique. Uniqueness makes sense only if it is meant to single out an historical event in memory, to place it, as it were, outside memory to make it incomparable. On the other side, comparison remains an unavoidable historical method. A comparison does not relativize or trivialize, but makes similarities and differences visible, that provides clarification and insight, not equation. Comparison by no means implies the illusion of complexity, and there is no doubt that the murder of European Jews differed from other examples of extreme mass violence in the 20th century, as well from the colonial genocidal violence. Nevertheless, it must be emphasized again in the discussion that scientific comparison does not mean equating, but rather the exploration of differences and similarities. So, in my view, it does not make sense to qualify the murder of the European Jews as absolutely, which happened completely without reason, as a destruction for the same sake of destruction. The actions of the perpetrators, as explained, were consistent and necessary for their ideological perspective. Instead of singling out the murder of the European Jews as unique or absolute, separating it from history, it makes much more sense to examine the violent event known as Holocaust as an entangled history of violence, in which one event is not viewed and singled out in isolation, but is examined in relation to the other acts of violence. So, for example, Christian Gerlach has some years ago proposed to speak of extremely violent societies where there are several groups of perpetrators on the one hand and several groups on victims on the other. And he made this within a great chapter about Indonesia and the Suharto mass violence in the 1960s. That would be, I think, well be a way leaving behind the impasse of a singularity or uniqueness, in which the outcome and evaluation of research are a foregone conclusion before the analysis has even begun. It is not normal, it is true not only with regard to the relationship with Nazi and Stalinist mass crimes, but also for this debate about the relationship between the Holocaust and colonial violence. If one considered that millions of people in the colonies, also as soldiers, as well as over 1 million African-American GIs, contributed to the victory about National Socialism, that in 1933, about 400,000 Jews lived in North Africa, as was almost as many as in the German Reich, who were just as much affected by the anti-Semitic persecution of the Vichy regime in the Second World War as by the Nazi persecution, then these few examples make it clear that the relationship between the Holocaust and colonialism must be examined much more complexly and intensively than the current discussion in the German debate is capable of. And it goes without saying that the Holocaust, the history of the Holocaust, understood in this way as a web of violence, is no longer a solely German history, but can only be researched and understood on a European and global scale. This does not absolve the Germans and Germany from responsibility for these crimes, but it does mean for researchers to examine the multiplicity of motives who participate in murder, where and why. Anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism played just an important role as greed, at the expectation of gaining more personal advantages under German occupation through collaboration, incidentally a field in which post-colonial research can be very helpful, because testing out spaces for action with the colonial rulers on the ground under completely asymmetrical conditions of violence was also elementary for the colonized. What remains? It remains the horror that this was possible in European civilization. Quote, and you know the quote, this should not have happened. Something happened that we all cannot cope with, as Hannah Arendt famously put it in 1964. This event is something that will permanently preoccupy us in Europe disturb us because it radically demands our idea of ourselves, of an enlightened European modernity. That is why Dan Diener's topos of the rupture of civilization, Zivilisationsbruch, I think is both appropriate and as well a contemporary document. Anyone who is committed in the philosophy of Kant, Hegel and Marx, anyone who is believing in the values of the European Enlightenment, humanity, liberty, equality, will inevitably perceive the National Socialist mass crimes as a rupture of this civilization. And the fact that the Holocaust could happen tore away all previously valid certainties. But the Holocaust is a product of modernity. Only with bureaucratic competence, state-organized organization, technically developed the logistic and communication could this mass murder in Auschwitz, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and in Bernburg and Hadamar, and the shooting trenches in the occupied territories be set in motion. So the Holocaust, therefore, always a radical criticism of the political, social, economic, and cultural order in which we live in Europe. The fact that these mass crimes could emanate from a modern state and a modern society fundamentally cast doubt on our self-image of modernity that is identified with progress, enlightenment, and human rights. It seems to me that the talk of Zivilisationsbruch, which cannot be missing from Holocaust memorial speech in Germany all over the time, has long since got rid of this radicalism, which deeply concerned Theodor Adorno or Max Horkheimer, Primo Levi or Ruth Klüger, Jean Amery or Imre Kertész, Sigmund Baumann or Hannah Arendt. In a speech of 1995, Kertész spoke of the unacceptable history because the Holocaust cannot simply be integrated into history, but rather disturbs any self-contentities. This is why I consider the current debate about the Holocaust and colonialism is extremely necessary, because it broadens the perspective. From a non-European point of view, the topos of Zivilisationsbruch has a different dimension. The mass murderous actions of the European colonizers who devastated regions, burned down cities, wiped out entire civilization in North and South America, in Africa and Asia, and completely annihilated indigenous people, also meant for the victims the experience of a rupture of civilization, of something that should not have happened. Talking about Zivilisationsbruch, that also refers to the manifold ruptures of civilizations that Europeans committed in the name of civilization and civilizing missions. Although it is repeatedly affirmed that no one wants victim competition, the topos of uniqueness inevitably creates hierarchies. Claims to public memory and recognition of other violent events are either ranked accordingly on a scale below, or must also strive to become singular. In Germany, the prioritization of Jewish victims, as expressed in the Berlin Memorial, has consistently led to other victim groups equally demanding public representation. Following the memorial of the persecuted homosexuals and the memorial of the genocide of the Roma and Sinti, a memorial to the repression of terror in Poland, and a documentation center of the National Social Occupation Policy in Europe are now to be built. And this development also inevitable because German society has changed since the days of the first Historikerstreit and nowadays amid the Historikerstreit 2.0. Today, many more people with migrant family backgrounds shape German societies and rightly claim to be perceived with their memories and experiences by the majority society. Moreover, Germany is part of a globalized world in which people and states of the global south demand respect, recognition, and compensation from Europe. References to the past are being renegotiated. So the Holocaust did not lose any of its horror when placed in a context of a European and global history of violence. The cognitive horror, as Dan Diener has aptly called it, is always present in the face of Belzec, Sobibor, Auschwitz, in the face of mass shooting in the occupied territories. This history will remain unacceptable. It is now up to us in Germany and in other European countries to equally take note of the horrors and the scale of European mass violence in the non-European world and to understand that this history is equally unacceptable. Thank you very much.
So, dear guests, it's an honor for me to speak today on the topics addressed by Michael Wildt in his talk, Was the Holocaust Unique? Remarks on a Current Debate. In this presentation, I aim to share some personal observations on the historical culture in Germany and the Netherlands in relation to the singularity paradigm discussion. And I will also share some related personal memories of events and debates that shaped my personal thinking on the subject. I had the privilege to read Michael Wildt's paper in advance to prepare today's discussion. I can imagine that the audience present here today experienced the same as I did while reading your text. Indeed, many of the topics you address relate to discussions we are having in the Netherlands, as academic community, in our international networks, and also among stakeholder communities in the public domain. At the same time, the debate you are reflecting upon, known as Historikerstreit 2.0, and in which you position yourself, is, without denying its international aspects, primarily based in Germany. In the Netherlands, these recent discussions have found remarkably little resonance. It's only incidentally referred to, for example, in a number of articles by Beatrice de Graaf, Frank van Vree, or Matthijs Kuipers. The question whether the Holocaust is seen as a unique historical phenomenon is not really debated here. One might regard this simply as a result of the different debate cultures. Debates in Germany tend to be very polemic, whereas in Dutch debates, an ethos of consensus tends to be appreciated and aspired. Yet, I consider that too easy an explanation, especially because debate cultures in both countries have been and are still very dynamic. Unlike the 1980s, the recent discussion in Germany is less a dispute between established scholars, since participants with more diverse societal and national backgrounds join the discussion. It's a development we can also witness in recent historical discussions in Dutch society, in particular those on the legacies of colonial violence and repression. So, even though the issue of the Historikerstreit 2.0 is not taken up in its entirety in the Netherlands, it certainly touches upon a multitude of debates in our country, both those occurring more recently as well as those of the last decades. In these discussions among Dutch historians, uniqueness or singularity paradigm does play a role, albeit not a central one. When it is mentioned, it's mostly in relation to morality, politics, or identity formation. Against that backdrop, against that backdrop, and with varying degrees of success, historians are searching for ways to connect stories about mass violence in transnational and global contexts, in order to develop a more balanced perspective in Holocaust and genocide studies, and also to convincingly create multi-perspectivity when studying the broad spectrum of violence. What I've learned from these explorations is that when stories touch each other, they start changing. Therefore, the underlying principle of my presentation will be a plea for plurality. This approach counters the distorting consequences of the singularity paradigm and built on Michael Wildt's plea for a broader definition of the Holocaust. Although there have been strong defensive reactions in Germany when it comes to exploring the connections between the Holocaust, genocides, and colonialism, during the years that I lived and worked in Germany, and during my many subsequent visits to the country, I became impressed by the many initiatives, civil or state-supported, that critically engage with the National Socialist past, and more recently also with colonial pasts, including the relevant interrelations between these phenomena. In general, I experienced such initiatives as critical, and I only rarely encountered forms of dogmatism or complacency. So for me, Dirk Moses' suggestion that we can speak of so-called self-appointed high priest guarding the Catechism of the Germany is a bit beside the point. I think Germany is not a totalitarian state. So the perspective negates the diversity of these historical and memory initiatives, even when the state plays a role in it, or when, as Michael Wildt states, a nationalization of remembrance policy took place. Having said this, Moses rightly pointed at the danger of political instrumentalization of the so-called Aufarbeitung of the National Socialist past, and the way it can structurally block an open-minded approach of other forms of violence and the related relevant interconnections. For me, the 2017 exhibition Deutscher Kolonialismus, Fragmente seiner Geschichte und Gegenwart in the Deutsches Historisches Museum in Berlin presented an excellent example of how German historians have found ways to critically deal with the past. This exhibition underlines that although the German Empire had been one of the major European colonial powers from 1884 until the end of the First World War, this colonial past has only been brought back to public attention in recent years. The exhibition was clearly inspired by post-colonial theoretical discourses and exposed how German colonial ideology had been shaped by a more general European idea of racial superiority. It addressed the broad spectrum of violence in colonial contexts, including the colonial war in Namibia, which culminated in genocide, and entanglements of colonialism with Nazi rule. In the Netherlands, rapid changes take place in our historical culture and debates. Traditionally, there was a strong academic focus on Dutch collaboration and the moral implications of it. In the public domain, the uniqueness of the Holocaust was and is generally taken for granted. Strange examples maybe, but it's not accepted when you compare the Holocaust with seal hunting or when anti-vaxxers wear Stars of David. Yet currently, connections between National Socialist and fascist regimes and colonial violence are more and more explored. It has slowly become more accepted to compare the Dutch Rabakadé massacre in Indonesia with the German Putte massacre in the Netherlands, as by the way already happened during the Indonesian Independence War. And it's now acknowledged that colonial ideas of settlement and resettlement have helped to shape the Westerbork transition camp. What is more, Westerbork, as well as Vught, sites of social marginalization and terror during the Holocaust, became connected to colonialism in the early post-war years. In 1951, both locations were used to house politically displaced Moluccans. At the same time, the resentment of survivors of Japanese internment camps, whose experiences after their return to the Netherlands were considered less severe than those of the survivors of the German concentration and extermination camps, still persist in Dutch discussions. More than the debate on uniqueness, a critique on Eurocentrism or on history writing based on a paradigm, first in Europe and then elsewhere in the world, represents the core of historical debates. This translates into a critical analysis of the colonial cultural archive and the colonial mindset during World War II, as well as present-day Netherlands. We are working to develop an increased understanding of colonialism as a transnational European and global phenomenon. Researchers more and more stop seeing the colonial world as connected to the Western metropole via a one-way or a two-lane road. It's considered to be part of a network. On top of that, the double standards and paradoxes of colonialism are now better understood. Civil rights and democracy, in all their exclusivity, were part of the colonial world order. The impact of such double standards is still felt today. Important to mention here is that new themes and debates are not only embraced, but also rejected. A striking example of the latter is how the Indonesian historian Bonnie Triana, guest curator in 2021 of the exhibition Revolutie in the Rijksmuseum, explained to the Dutch audience what for him, as an Indonesian citizen, was the racist connotation of the Dutch term bersiap. This term, an Indonesian word meaning be prepared, which figured prominently in the canon of late colonial memory, denotes in Dutch historical narratives the violent and chaotic phase of the Indonesian national revolution following the end of World War II, during which thousands of Dutch, Eurasian and Chinese people were killed by Indonesians. These questions and debates on colonialism also affect our understanding of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism, thus producing substantial discussions. At NIOD, some researchers adhere to the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism and its guidelines, which states that comparing Israel with settler colonialism should not be regarded anti-Semitic, whereas others adhere to the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism and the additional examples in which colonialism is not mentioned. Opinions on this topic are, as I said, divided, and I do not think that in itself is a problem. We touch on sensitive topics that are related to morality, politics, and identity formation when analyzing the interconnections between genocides, including the Holocaust, mass violence, and colonialism. But that, I would say, is no reason not to try connecting past that we were trained to understand in isolation. I would like to continue my presentation by sharing some memories of 3 formative events that sharpened my thinking about the topics involved. Firstly, maybe some of you were there, in 2011, NIOD organized the conference The Holocaust and Other Genocides in the Peace Palace in The Hague. This happened in the framework of the Dutch chair of the Task Force for International Cooperation on Holocaust Education, Remembrance and Research. For NIOD, this presented a meaningful moment since it coincided with the 2010 merger of the Netherlands Institute for War Documentation with the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And I do remember how tense the audience was during this conference, which was dedicated to the place of the Holocaust in the history of genocide. It should not come as a surprise that an unambiguous conclusion was not reached during the discussions. On the one hand, the organizers paid respect to the position of Yehuda Bauer, who accepted the comparison, yet at the same time considered the Holocaust to be unparalleled. On the other hand, Christian Gerlach elaborated on his extremely violent societies concept, you mentioned him, published the year before. And he remarked, as I remember well, that the context of mass violence matters, and that the uniqueness discussion was an unnecessary and undesired reprise of the 1980s Historikerstreit. From that moment onwards, at the NIOD, we continued to expand our research on the Holocaust, global genocides, and other moments of mass violence, which has enriched our understanding of the phenomena involved. And I should also mention here that is, of course, connected to the Srebrenica report of 2002 as well. Yet, this trajectory towards a broader perspective has not always been easy. In 2017, I attended a debate at CG Soma, our sister institute, as we always say it. I don't know why sister, but brother institute in Brussels on the future of the European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, ERI. And ERI is an international digital network and community coordinated by NIOD. Some of you are here, I see. At that time, the ERI community was considering whether it would, like NIOD, expand its activities towards genocide studies and the related archives. Opposition against this idea was principled, emotionally charged, and in the end successful. Dan Mitchman, historian at ERI partner Yad Vashem, argued, quotation, "When you call the Holocaust a genocide, you don't understand the true nature of the Holocaust," end quotation. For me, that was reason to study his work, and from his publications, I learned that in his view, the Holocaust goes beyond the generally accepted genocide model and definition. This is, of course, a very relevant and important observation. But in the context of the CG Soma meeting, it was used as an argument supporting memory politics. On the level of archives and data, the Holocaust should stay unflanked, and that's what happened, unfortunately, I should say. Thirdly, I would like to share my memories of the discussion on the specificity of colonial violence during the so-called the so-called Otgooi project. I don't know if anybody knows what the Otgooi project is, but it denotes the project Independence, Decolonization, Violence and War in Indonesia, 1940-1945. So that was the project NIOD did in order to study the Dutch war crimes. And I was part of the team of researchers. Inspired by Kim Wagner, I initially advocated that colonial violence was unique. The so-called colonial anxiety among colonizers was an incentive for them to use particularly brutal violence, meant as exemplary. And they could use it because it was directed against the so-called uncivilized. Many Dutch soldiers did indeed expect that the use of extreme force would create respect towards them. Many additional factors play a role in this: colonial racism, denial of rights, and the dehumanization of the enemy. Yet, in the end, and it may come as a surprise, the team, including myself, decided not to speak of colonial violence as a separate category. Othering occurs in all kinds of conflicts. Violence often has a totalizing tendency, and moreover, the anxieties of the perpetrators exist in almost every war or conflict. In this respect, it's relevant to mention that particularly Gerlach's conception of extremely violent societies was instrumental to develop an understanding of the dynamics of violence in a colonial context. So we at NIOD use this concept really as a traveling concept. It goes from one topic we research to another. So I'm always at the end of my talk, and maybe it's time to release what I would like to call the small elephant in the room. What about the name of NIOD, Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies? Are we happy with Holocaust being mentioned as a separate category? Is it perhaps time to change that? Today's topic, so much is clear, goes into the heart of the Institute and what we are doing and what we are there for. And it creates a certain momentum. Behind the scenes, we continually discuss our title. It happened this afternoon as well. And that should be no secret. In my opinion, our name is complex, but also balanced. For NIOD, based in Amsterdam, a city that once was one of the major sites of the Holocaust, it's self-evident that we study the Holocaust as an event. While at the same time, since our Srebrenica report and the merger with the Institute or the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, we are engaged in studying genocides as events, but also as a concept, and all other forms of mass violence, like now, for example, in Syria. We will continue to create multi-perspectivity and allow methods and concepts to travel between the different events we study in an unlimited manner. We respect sensibilities, but analyze all forms of entanglements. To conclude, inspired by my example of ERI, I would like to suggest establishing international genocide research infrastructure. So let's return to the initiative of 2017. Archival collections constitute the foundation of our academic and societal work, and it's important to broaden the base of our work as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your personal talk as well. And thank you for your very interesting longer talk as well. We decided that we have just a short discussion, and then the public, of course, you may ask your questions. And I want to start with Michael Wildt. Actually, I think it's very clear that you defend the idea of Den Diener of a civilisationsbruch, or civilizational rupture, and you tend to extend it more or less to the colonial history as well. And of course, you're aware that Dirk Moses was criticizing this. So this is an argument against Dirk Moses, perhaps. Yeah. I understand that. I just wanted to ask you that how do you see the civilizational rupture in the colonial context?
I think that my intention was that this term was a very important term in the German debate. You will never find a Holocaust talk or on the end of January 27th of century without the mentioning that this has been a Zivilisationsbruch. So it was some kind of a term every politician uses it and has used it, and is on the one side, I think, if you think about Zygmunt Bauman, Hannah Arendt, Ruth Klüger, it's much more than a term you use for memorial talks or political speeches. It's much more radical and much more radical intended by Dan Diener than now used in talks of politicians. And on the other side, if we are taking the researching colonial violence, then it destroyed civilizations in Africa and Asia and other regions of the world. And so I think it could be an appropriate argument to use this term to make clear what colonial violence has been. That is destroying civilization in the name of a allegedly higher and superior civilization. So this term could be some kind, in the German debate, I hope so, could some kind of term or a key for understanding what, how murderous and how genocidal colonial violence, of course, even and although for the German case, has been.
Yeah, now I'm very curious. Is it a concept you are using in the Netherlands?
Well, I
the colonial
like
context.
Very much when you don't speak of civilisationsbruch, but of civilisationsbrüche. So there are more ruptures. At the same time, I think in Indonesia they would say, well, it's your problem. And why do you keep to the word civilisation? So this is something you should really, in a way, debate with the people involved. And when we were there, the Dutch used to talk about police actions, number one, number two. And after a while, you find out when you talk and question and ask and listen that they have their own words. In Javanese, they call it geger, and it means the world is tumbling down. So geger 1 is police action 1, geger 2, SATU is the second one, and they also have the third one, and that's Indonesia in 1965. So there you really see that the contexts are totally different. But in a European context, when you are criticizing the belief in the progress modernity would bring, which is part of the civilisationsbruch concept, it's a huge step forward when you make it plural. But you should be aware of the other side. Yeah.
And is it a concept at the NIOD which is discussed, which you're working with, or?
It must have been discussed, but not that I am aware of, but I'm not always.
So that's a very interesting remark, and that means that it is a concept which is in Germany very important, right. Actually, also to understand what has happened, and perhaps even as a form of self-representation, I think, of the historical world, so to speak.
Yeah, and this is a term connected extremely close to the Holocaust, and therefore to use this term to widen the perspective, I think it could be useful for the German discussion. So you are in the Netherlands much more acquainted with colonialism, because Netherlands has been a colonial power since till after the end of the Second World War. And in Germany, there's I think a significant characteristicum of the debate now, and even the Historikerstreit 2.0, that there is not really a deep knowledge about German colonialism and German colonial power. So in the public debate in Germany, there is some kind, not really well known, but the names are in presence about the genocide against Nama and Herero at the beginning of the 19th century. But for example, the Machi mass violence in East Africa, which also committed by the German colonial power, I think only a few people are knowing about this a little bit, and it's not part of the public debate. So the German debate has failed in some or hasn't reached the possible level in debate about colonialism and the Holocaust, but because there is much more debate or much more knowledge about the Holocaust. Of course, at some time, because Germany is has been responsible for the Holocaust, and therefore the knowledge and the dealing with this past is essential for German history. But on the other side, there is only a little knowledge about the real power, the real violence Germany committed in former times in its colonies.
Okay, I've got just one more question about anti-Semitism definitions. You said that at the NIOD, people adhere various anti-Semitism definitions, but that doesn't matter that much, or am I wrong in that sense that you can cooperate very well? It sounds to me very Dutch. In Germany, this could be impossible.
Yeah, I think I can answer this question on many levels, but first, NIOD does not exist. We are a group of researchers and we discuss things, and sometimes we have different opinions, and that's not a problem, that's a good thing. So, yeah, maybe that's the best answer to give here. People are engaged in this field, so and sometimes this engagement leads to different perspectives on what we are discussing, and especially with this definition case, that is the case, I think.
But does that say something about Dutch culture, that it is not thoroughly debated, but we cooperate amongst each other, whereas in Germany this would perhaps be a strong debate. You do debate,
yeah,
okay.
I don't say we don't debate it, but we accept that there are differences in opinions, and we try to explore what is the essence of the difference in opinion. And
Okay, are there questions? Yes, Natalie.
Thank you both so much. I really appreciate So I really like both of your contributions a lot, and it made me think. I mean, it came up a little bit like there's this sort of. So this is a very, I shouldn't say civilized, but this is a very scholarly, useful. Attempt to basically kind of chart the field and understanding, especially also with going back to the 80s and going back to the Cold War, and how does it even come about, and how did this new Historikerstreit, that's the title, come about, and then kind of basically building, thinking forward, right? I mean, what do we need? Where should we go? And I agree with all of that. But it made me think a little bit more about, so we still, the emotions kind of come up, right? I mean, there's a reason. And of course, you can say some of it is the German feuilletons, right, that really like to kind of go in a certain direction. But there's still some element of it that maybe I think, I kind of struggle to understand properly without getting into it, right? I mean, that's always the problem. I mean, you can kind of throw yourself into it, but then you don't understand it better. And I do think that this, this mentioning of Zivilisationsbruch is maybe really interesting, an interesting way to kind of think about it. And it made me think of. So, and I just wonder, in terms of even if we broaden the historical picture of how did this whole, how did this tension come about, and what does civilization mean? And of course, understanding. I mean, the Den-Diner concept is really, it captures, right? I mean, this sort of moral shock, right? Really, that the Holocaust stands for, and it made me, first of all, it made me think of, I quote it often in debates, but Aimé Césaire's formulation, where he talks about, the term Holocaust didn't exist yet, but he talks about the Nazi war as a choc en retour in French, which made, Europeans, Western Europeans, suddenly realize something that they had done themselves already. They were part, as victims in a way, they were part of, as occupied countries, they had become part of something where they could see the horror of the violence, and then suddenly look in the mirror, and then wanted to get rid of that, right? That is what, Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism at the beginning says. And so yeah, and I mean, the question is maybe, you know, this, you know, whereas I do see the relevance of that concept to capture the whole, that also might made us become stuck in that tradition of that kind of shock. And so I would just say to agree, because that means that it's still on the basis of it doesn't happen here, right? And part of that colonial version of the civilization model is always to project the violence elsewhere, right? That is what legitimates the violence, is that the violence cannot come, the true violence can never come from Europe. It always comes from elsewhere, and then you are, you know, you are legitimized to use it against that threat. So isn't there still the sort of the problem that we keep being stuck in that model, even if we don't want to, and even if we don't intend to? And then I stop.
Can you introduce yourself?
I'm Natalie Scholz. I'm a modern historian at the University of Amsterdam.
Yeah, I think that you're mentioning that it's this emotional dimension is very, I think, very important. It's really has been really a shock. And you heard, if you heard or see Hannah Arendt when she is saying this sense, you see she's even 20 years later in 1964, she is shocked. That has never been happened, and that never should have happened. And so from this fear, from this shock, I think there is a lot of fear that it could happen again. And this fear that it could happen again, and once again Jews could be the victims of violence, is also part of the debate in Germany. You know, there isn't an emotion, and I could understand, really understand it, because right-wing anti-Semitism is part of some German society. There has been murderous attack at Halle against Jews, and there is still anti-Semitic attacks in German streets every day nowadays. So talking or the fear of the relativizing debating the Holocaust could be minimizing is this shock, or minimizing this, this shock is part and element of the Historikerstreit 2.0. It's not really written in the feuilletons, but I think in the debates I had with my Jewish friends and others, this is part of the debate. And on the other side, it is a real challenging idea that to see maybe that is even a figure in which we stuck when we are only, or if we are describe violence as a rupture of civilization because we are continuing the shock and preventing us from analyzing the violence and the development and the radicalization of violence. And maybe that's, I must think about it, but it's really, I think it's challenging because it's either analytical and emotional idea and reflection about this term and what the consequences of this term. And I don't have an answer yet at the day, but I think it's a real challenging idea.
And Dandino speaks of a black box, the moment when every analytical possibility to explain stopped, actually. And, yeah.
No, very brief, but Fanon, he wasn't shocked at all. He said Europe gets what it always did outside Europe. And that's also in the 1940s. Yeah.
Fanon was very radical because in this consequence he said, okay, the white people has been shocked because they are killing for the first time they are genocidal, acting against their own white people, and that's not our business. But even in this debate, I found it, for me, interesting was that some of the Holocaust survivors like Améry read Frantz Fanon and discussed with him, discussed his texts. And so maybe that even in this it's for the German experience, that we are not realizing that there has been several connections between Holocaust memory and the memory of colonial violence. Many Jewish activists have participated in the struggle for emancipation in the United States, even in their and so Holocaust remembrance or Holocaust memory could be a way for fighting for human rights and not to close the own terrain of memory, but open it and said this experience should encourage us to fight against discrimination and discrimination, violence all over the world.
Peter Romein.
Thank you very much for your, well, not introductions, but elaborations on a very important topic. And as a veteran of NIAT, I can only subscribe to what Martijn said about the value of a plural debate, because it helps us to come further. But my consideration concerning the word Zivilisationsbruch would be that it is not a matter that we have discussed in the Netherlands very much, because it is more kind of a general, it would be more kind of a general description of what people experience, but what does feed it. And in those days, in the 1940s, I would say, there was, of course, a dominant Christian discourse about responsibility and guilt. And there was not the idea that civilization had collapsed, but that people had failed to be true believers and to live to the live up to the requirements of the creed, of Christian creed. And the reconstructionist idea of how to rebuild a society was very much inspired also by the non-believers in kind of a moral rebuilding of a common sense of what is decent and what is not. And that would not prescribe specifically a pacifist direction, although there was, of course, much more interest in matters like guilt. I mean, Karl Jaspers was admired by his Dutch colleagues, and they elaborated very much about what the Dutch had in common with the Germans, where they had failed as well as the Germans had failed. And that was just leaving alone the basic foundations of their social life, and that is the Christian one, be it Protestant or be it the Roman Catholic, or be it different variations of Protestantism. And I think that in order to understand what people experienced as, well, the fundamental upheaval of their lives was the violent character of war. The victimization, which was generalized and not tied to the Holocaust in particular, and the idea that in one way or another the ruins of society had to be reconstructed by a moral regeneration. So the regeneration idea, we forget nowadays, that's basically, I think, the point of my intervention, how much top-down but also self-experienced religious feeling was responsible for the perception of what had really happened on a very fundamental way. And the Holocaust was pushed away very far. That was something that the Jews had lived through, and well, they would come to terms or not. And in the same way, in the Colonial War, there was lots. I mean, many radical Christians believed that it was a just war, also for the sake of converting. Or at least facilitating Christian life in the colonies. So there's so much to be said, but let's not forget about this. That was my issue.
Okay. Yes, the lady.
Thank you for your talks. Martijn, I'm glad you mentioned stakeholder groups, because they also debate memory cultures around violence and whether the Holocaust can be compared to colonial violence. So an important stakeholder group for this question in the Netherlands, of course, are Dutch veterans. And I noticed late last year in some pieces of journalism, there were a couple of articles in the Groene Amsterdammer about perpetrators, that we need to start using the framework of perpetrators to understand some of what Dutch soldiers had done in Indonesia, as though this were kind of the first time that this concept were being taken seriously in the Netherlands. And so I wanted you to reflect a little bit on, my question is, how do you think that veterans in the Netherlands are handling this kind of comparison? You talked about what historians who worked on the project did, but of course you also had to work with veterans and other stakeholder groups. Do you think veterans, for example, are as comfortable as with these kinds of comparisons as historians are?
I think the German answer would be jein, so yes and no. We know, or, yeah, I think you studied the letters and the photo albums and all. You see that soldiers at the time made the comparison themselves. So from the start, they were aware that they were doing things that you could call war crimes. That's no secret. We all know that. Family members know that as well. At the same time, there are veteran groups that together keep up a certain morality. And so it was always a very brave thing when you were a veteran to speak out publicly. So make it more open. But this also happened. So the fact that we did do this research, that we know what happened, is really we thank the veterans for that they supported us and that they shared their experiences and critical self-examination. At the same time, there are, of course, groups that don't want to discuss it at all. And I must say I'm a bit disappointed in the veteran groups that really make themselves spokesmen of the very conservative, propaganda-like, I'm open today, way of discussing the way soldiers behaved in Indonesia. So in that sense, I think veterans are sometimes instrumentalized. So, and how can I explain what I'm saying now? They are instrumentalized. We feel solidarity with veterans. They don't want to discuss this topic, so we should not have a critical look at this war as a whole. And who profits from this? That is the political and the more legal dimension of our society, who in a way allow these things to happen. Yeah, that's my answer.
My question is actually an extension of the aforementioned to you, Michael. First of all, thank you very much for your very enlightening expose. My question comes based on a comment made in passing by you, Martijn, on the Indonesian perception on the discourse that we're having right now in Europe. And so seeing that this is very much in the German context with former German colonies, for example, Namibia, could you dedicate some words on how Namibian academics view the discussion that is going on right now or over the last few years? Do you have an overview of that?
Yeah, I think it's significant that it has been taken decades before the German government admits that it had been a genocide took place in Namibia, and not because of moral reasons, but because of reasons of possible compensation. it was just only a financial reason that the German governments for so long didn't talk about genocide, they talk about mass violence and so on. And even now, when the German government have admitted that it had been a genocide, it's still a debate about compensation. And if you see, now it's a compromise that has been disputed in Namibia, because who will get the money and what is the purpose of the money and what will be done with the money. But when you see the relation, we talk about 1 billion for Namibia for all the genocide, and after the aggression, Russian aggression against the Ukraine, the German government are funding 100 billions for the new army and for military purposes. And so you see the realization, there's 1 billion for the Namibian people in compensation for the genocide, and 100 billions of euros in the wake of the war and the military equipment of the Bundeswehr. And so I think that is still an asymmetric relationship between, or for example, not only an anecdote, because I just in February I spoke the wonderful colleague. She is talking about, she's from Namibia. She's the head of the political education, sozusagen politische Bildung, also in Namibia for democratization. There's not a huge institution. In Germany, the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung is a huge institution, several millions, and she only has a few people, and of course, and funding, and not being compared with German. But when she is willing, or she has to travel to Germany as an important representative of the Namibian government and a public institution, she has to accept sozusagen appreciate for a visa, and she gets this visa only for 3 weeks. But on the other side, when Germans will travel to Namibia because of their ancestors have been settled there, there's daily a flight from Frankfurt to Windhoek without any visa. And so you see this still on relationship. I think it is a scandal that this colleague, a really public important figure, no? For example, talk about the president of the Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung has to be apply for a visa to visit Namibia. It was been a scandal in the German newspapers. But on the other side, it's normal. And I think that is still a everyday document for this asymmetric relationship between the former colonizing powers and the former colonized.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. My question goes to Michael, who in the very beginning you pointed out that in Germany the debate about the genocide is not about the others but about themselves, so about their own guilts in the past. And I just checked the Wikipedia account on genocides recognized by Germany, and I've noticed that in fact there are only 3. 2 of them, the Holocaust and Herero genocide, recognized in 1921, and the third is the recent one in December 2022, Holodomor, the famine in Ukraine in the 1930s. So, how does it relate to this claim that in Germany the debate about the genocide is about their own guilts? And how would you position this recent recognition of Holodomor as a genocide within this Historikstreit which occurs nowadays. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a difficult problem because there is one juristic legal definition of the genocide, with the Genocide Convention made the United Nations in 1948. And if you take this criteria for genocide, you have some kind of legal overview which could be called and could be coined as genocide. That has to be an international legally framework for this, because this is the foundation for the United Nations to intervene in other countries when there is still claimed a genocide. For example, in Darfur, when they examined the genocidal practices of the Khamin warriors taking place several years ago, the United Nations didn't intervene because the legal experts and the legal advisors of the United Nations said that there's no genocide taking place, and so there is no foundation for an intervention for the United Nations. This is one side, but of course this term and this concept of genocide is debated in, or is used for historical or political analysis too. And there's of course several and a plurality of concepts or criteria which could be called a genocide or not. And so if you look at Wikipedia and others, of course you will feel a mixing of diverse criteria for genocide, and the basis for the resolution of the German Parliament to call the Holodomor a genocide, I think it's the context of the Russian aggression against the Ukraine, and there are, of course, or you can expect that there are some colleagues or several colleagues of mine who are historians of Eastern European history, which called the Holodomor a Stalinist mass crime, but not a genocide. And but this is a problem if a mass crime is coined politically as a genocide, when the scholarly debate is open for definitions, how to understand, how to regard Stalinist mass crimes in this way. On the other side, in the recent research in the last years on Stalinist mass crimes, there is an ethnic bias in this, that not only political crimes. Our colleague nowadays has underlined that the operations against the Poles, against the Germans in the Stalinists, of course, not only politically intended, but have an ethnic dimension. So you could coin even. There are reasons. I think there are reasons. I'm not a Eastern European historian, but there are reasons to coin and to define the Holodomor in this ethnically dimension as a genocide.
What you were talking about were political decisions of the Bundestag, for example. I would like to thank you all, by the way, with your very interesting questions, and the speakers as well. This was a very good and open discussion, which could have been much more emotional, in the sense that the emotional tone of the debate in Germany is very high, so to speak. So thank you very much, and I wish you a good evening.